You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday the 25th of January. Serial criminals who avoid jail outnumber the prison population. Uncovered the toxic gene hiding in GM crops. German economy, Europe's last hope, begins to slump. Austria bucks trend with conscription vote. Numbers rack up on attacks in police in Italy. Nick Griffin, MEP from the belly of the beast. Brain scans could find out who is racist. Hanged for waging war against God. Thought for the day, a short thought on education. And finally, a counsellor for Carys in North Wales UK news. Serial criminals who avoid jail outnumber the prison population. More than 90,000 burglars, muggers and other serious criminals with 10 or more convictions escaped with a slap on the wrist when they committed another offence last year. Incredibly, the number of serial lawbreakers who avoided a jail sentence in this way is greater than the 83,000 inmates currently behind bars. The hardened criminals instead received fines, community service or a fully suspended sentence for crimes such as violence against the person, theft and sexual offences. The analysis was produced by the newly established Centre for Crime Prevention. Peter Cuthbertson, the think tank's chief executive, said, "These figures show the appalling failure of soft sentencing." Uncovered the toxic gene hiding in GM crops. Revelation throws new doubt over safety of foods. A virus gene that could be poisonous to humans has been missed when GM food crops have been assessed for safety. GM crops such as corn and soya, which are being grown around the world for both human and farm animal consumption, include the gene. A new study by the EU's official food watchdog, the European Food Safety Authorities, has revealed that the international approval process for GM crops failed to identify the gene. As a result, watchdogs have not investigated its impact on human health and the plants themselves when assessing whether they were safe. The findings are particularly powerful because the work was carried out by an independent expert rather than GM critics. European news. German economy, Europe's last hope, begins to slump. Despite a drumbeat of optimistic forecasts from economists and upbeat statements from various European leaders, the actual news on the economy continues to be grim, with figures released Tuesday showing that Germany, the contingent's flagship economy, contracted by about 0.5% in the final months of last year. Combined with a flurry of disappointing results in other major economies, the stumble raised questions about Europe's ability to escape recession. Portugal's central bank cut its economic forecast for the year on Tuesday, saying its economy will contract more steeply than expected. France said it was likely to miss its targets for narrowing the budget deficit, raising the prospects of deeper spending cuts and additional taxes. Last month, Britain said its austerity budgets would extend 3 extra years to 2018 because of weaker than expected growth. Austria bucks trend with conscription vote. In a national referendum, Austrians have voted to keep military conscription, bucking the trend towards professional armies in the rest of Western Europe. In a referendum on Sunday, nearly 60% of Austrians voted to maintain the status quo, where men have to serve in the army for 6 months or in the civilian service for 9 months when they reach the age of 18. Some 22,000 young men are currently drafted into the military in this way every year. This result makes Austria one of only a handful of European countries to maintain conscription. Most Western European nations scrapped compulsory military service in the last 2 decades, including France in 1996, Spain in 2001 and Germany in 2011. The United Kingdom abolished military service back in 1960. Military service is still compulsory in 5 other European countries: Denmark, Finland, Greece, Cyprus and Estonia. Italian police attacked 2,290 times in 2012. Police officers in Italy experienced 2,290 attacks in 2012, the Traffic Police Association said on Friday. The figure was 2.7% more than in 2011 and refers to attacks perpetrated against street police and other law officers. In 22.6% of cases the attack involved the use of a weapon, and in 35% of cases perpetrators were under the influence of alcohol or drugs, according to the association that has monitored the phenomenon of violence directed at the police for the last decade. In 43.9% of the cases the attack was perpetrated by non-Italian aggressors drunk or high 35% of the time. A gang of immigrants who appeared to be Arabs were roaming the streets of Eindhoven in the Netherlands looking for people to beat up. They came upon a Dutchman and proceeded to beat him viciously. A video of the incident was leaked and uploaded to the internet, and a massive backlash ensued in the social media. Now the police have ordered the video removed from all news sites and all required that the faces of the perpetrators be blurred. 2 of the youths, who are from Belgium, are said to have given themselves up to the police. I now hand you over to Nick Griffin, MEP, from the belly of the beast.
A combination of preparations for this weekend's BNP Organisers Conference, bad weather, and definitely having contracted the plague, kept me away from Brussels this week. But even without having been there, I can tell you exactly how much interest there was in Brussels over David Cameron's referendum pledge. None. Zilch, nout, nix, nothing. It's business as usual in the belly of the beast, grabbing and gulping fresh powers and more taxes. Why? Don't the Eurocrats care that Britain may now be slippering down a greasy rubbish chute out of their rose-tinted world? No, it's just they don't believe a word of it, with good reason, as it happens. First, whatever else these people are and are not, they do have long experience of assessing the character of politicians. So they already know what you and I already know, that David Cameron is a snake oil salesman. They will remember that this is the very same man who, before the last election, gave us all a cast-iron guarantee of a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty and then broke that pledge. They know that Cameron's need and political peril now is even graver than before he failed to win his first general election. So they know that he can be relied upon to say whatever is necessary to placate his own backbenchers and avoid him staggering out of a meeting with his loyal cabinet with his back full of knives. They also know that Mr. Cameron can promise the moon to anyone daft enough to believe he can deliver it after the next general election, because he's not going to win the next general election. This pledge could well prevent the Tories' 2015 defeat from becoming a massacre, but even if it caused UKIP to implode and vanish, which it will not, Cameron's promise will not alter the basic pattern of the next general election. The Tories will lose scores of seats, their Lib Dem coalition partners faced obliteration outside of a handful of seats in the southwest, and Labour, despite the Miliband impediment, will be the victors. Even if he meant it, therefore, Cameron's referendum pledge is worthless, because he will be ex-Prime Minister and ex-leader of the Conservative Party long before the 2017 deadline that he pulled out of his hat just after the very porky referendum pig flew out. If Cameron really meant what he said about renegotiating our membership, he would have proved it by invoking the Article 50 on the functioning of the Treaty of European Union. This is the procedure by which a nation gives notice of intention to leave and kickstarts the necessary negotiations. Under Article 50, such haggling would have gone on until 2016 in any case. So if we're really going to get the choice to leave in 2017, there's no time to lose. And if he really intended to renegotiate wonderful new cherry-picked terms for Britain, he'd have gone about it that way, playing tough, threatening a Samson in the Temple riot of destruction and using such recklessness as a bargaining tool. Instead, Cameron asks us to believe that he intends to go to the negotiating table, having already told the other side that he's determined to stay in. Well, perhaps he does, in which case the only question is who is the bigger fool, David Cameron or anyone who actually believes that his negotiations will produce anything of any value to Britain. There's an even more important factor weighing on any informed judgment on Cameron's latest bit of snake oil salesmanship, a little matter of temporal reality, to wit, 4 more years of events. For, despite President Barroso's recent claim that the euro crisis is effectively over, the reality is that the economic and political storm clouds still bearing down on the bad ship Europe are such that it's distinctly questionable whether the euro project will still even be there in 2017. Spain and Italy may not be about to collapse into sovereign default, but the gap between northern and southern Europe continues to grow. A fascinating study by Professor Paolo Manasse of Bologna University, entitled Eurozone Crisis, It Ain't Over Yet, has just highlighted some of the key problems. The divergence of GDP between Germany and Italy since 2006 is now a whopping 14% and growing faster than ever. Spain has just recorded another quarter of accelerating contraction and another year of declining foreign investment. So many people have now been out of work for so long in Spain, Italy and Greece that the damage to their skills base and human capital is now permanent. Perhaps most telling of all are the shocking jumps of debt to GDP ratios of the last year, as misguided austerity measures have starved the basket case countries of money. Ireland's debt ratio mountain grew 13%, Spain's 10.7%, Portugal's 9.9%, and Italy's 7.4%. So, despite, or rather because of, all the cuts and all the pain, those countries are now even more in debt than they were before they started to take their austerity medicine. All of which would be bad enough in a dictatorship. But fortunately, those countries are not dictatorships. They're democracies. Flawed democracies, of course, but still places where individual politicians and parties have an unavoidable rendezvous with the voters. Most of them, it must be noted, well before 2017. So how many of today's ruling politicians and parties will still be there by then? And if they're not, if they've been replaced by anti-austerity parties who refuse to make their electors pay the price for the crisis of the banksters and the single currency utopians, what then? The Spanish Premier, for example, won a landslide just a year ago, yet his approval rate has now slumped to just 15%. Meanwhile, in Germany, the figure for those opposing the transfer of further powers to Brussels will soon reach 2/3. No illusions that the storm is ending soon should be entertained, warns Professor Manasse. Indeed, we may well be in the eye of the hurricane. The longer-term prospects for the survival of the euro not only are not improving, they're actually getting worse, he concludes. So don't lose any sleep over the question of whether David Cameron can be trusted. Of course he can't. But whether or not we ever get that referendum, the present European status quo cannot survive. The whole lot could collapse, rather as the Soviet Union did in 1989. Or its bosses could try to avoid that fate by proposing a radical jump to immediate and total economic and political union. That was, after all, their goal from the very start, only to find that no one is willing to jump just because they say jump. The resulting crisis of legitimacy would almost immediately become a currency and banking system crisis of shattering proportions, with national governments forced to run for the exits or go down the same plug hole. All in all, then, David Cameron's pledge this week should enable him to hang on to the loyalty of his own MPs. It might even help him to push the UKIP genie back in the bottle, although with the BBC rubbing it ceaselessly, even that isn't a foregone conclusion. But not much else will change. In the end, if the pressure of public sentiment did indeed force the entire political establishment to follow Cameron's reluctant lead and to give us a referendum, you can absolutely guarantee that it wouldn't be a fair referendum. Because we've been here before. I was a young nationalist activist in 1975 when Harold Wilson gave us the common market referendum that he, like Cameron, an ardent pro-European traitor, had been forced to offer in order to preserve his party unity and cadge enough votes to win the general election of the previous October. And yes, we got our referendum and we fought very hard to win it for British freedom and a no vote. But the whole thing was rigged from the start. Every household got 3 booklets, one giving the yes case, one giving the no case, and one giving the government's view, which was, of course, yes. Then on top of that 2-to-1 bias in the official literature, for every pound that the antis had to spend, the big business-backed yes campaign had £11. It wasn't a fair referendum. The Europhiles simply bought a yes majority. That's why, while the BNP supports the use of binding citizens' initiative referenda, we recognise also that such a reform by itself would not make Britain any more democratic or better run. The questions of media control and the buying of influence through big money also have to be addressed before any referendum even stands a chance of producing a genuine result. In the meantime, We in the British National Party do not need any referendum result to tell us what should be done with the EU and the question of British membership. 1,000 years of independence and hundreds of thousands of deaths in the cause of our national freedom cannot in any case be undone by a plebiscite in which the short-term perceived interests of the present generation are the deciding factor. The nationalist principle doesn't need a vote of approval to make it right and true. Britain should regain her freedom, and the political pygmies who sold it should face trial for treason. We don't need a referendum on Europe. We just need to take the treaties of Rome and of Lisbon and tear them up. We don't need negotiations. We need a unilateral declaration of independence from the European Union. We don't need anyone's permission. We just need to keep our own money and return to our own rules. We don't need a debate. We need a good old-fashioned bonfire.
Thank you, Nick. As ever, a fascinating input. World News. How scientists could use brain scans to detect whether you are a racist. Brain scans show differences in the way people with negative racial attitudes perceive black and white faces. Brain scans could soon be used to detect whether or not people are racist, scientists say. Researchers found that brain scans were able to pick up on the differences on the way that people with implicit negative racial attitudes viewed black and white faces. Racial stereotypes are previously shown to have subtle and unintended consequences on how we treat members of different race groups. But the new research published in Psychological Science, a journal for the Association of Psychological Science, shows race biases also increase differences in the brain's representations of faces. Psychologists Tobias Brosch of the University of Geneva in Switzerland and Ayel Bar-David and Elizabeth Phelps of New York University examined activity in the brain while participants looked at pictures of white and black faces. World Date reporter states, they really don't need that, do they? Hanged for waging war against God. Iran publicly executes 2 men after they posted a YouTube clip of themselves committing an armed robbery, which ended up on Iranian state television. It showed 4 masked men on motorbikes approaching their victim before assaulting him with a machete and taking his bag and jacket. Ali Reza Mahaifa, 23, and Mohammed Ali Savari, 20, were executed in Tehran, and although the deaths of Mahaifa and Savari had all the accoutrements of the 21st century, the essence of their executions was medieval. The pair, executed for robbery, were paraded before a baying crowd of 300 people in a public park at the centre of the Iranian capital. Then the pair were raised up by 2 extending cranes to a height of around 15 feet. They were dead within seconds. They were tried through YouTube and hanged by remote control as hundreds captured their agonising last moments on mobile phones. The 2 accomplices were sentenced to 10 years in prison and 74 lashes. A World Date reporter comments, the mind boggles, why did they take pictures of themselves doing the crime? They live in a society that kills at a whim. They must have been slightly challenged, one really has to think. Thought for the day, the negative reality of British education today. Now, I'm not a qualified teacher, but I did teach for 6 months at a time in 2 schools, one at a private school and the other a very good village comp. Both classes were 12 to 13 years and I taught art and free drawing, which I was trained at art school to do. So I would never underestimate the power that teachers use to have in the futures of many of our young in the 60s through to the 70s. That picture nowadays is not so good or so simple. Gone are the fairly straightforward rules of education in this country. In the good, bad old days, as I have said before on World Date, parents had more choices and unfortunately most of those choices were down to finances. But that hasn't changed really, it's just the question of how much. If you're really going to rely on state education, then it would behove you to get into as good a catchment area as you can get. But with house prices around London still rising and most of our large cities bulging with ethnic communities, you have a very slim chance of getting a good catchment area and a school that is not of the spot the white face variety. It depends on your cultural outlook and your liberality. In the past, many parents went without flash cars and homes and holidays to pay for their children to attend either a convent, private school, or if lucky and your offspring passed the 11+, a grammar school. I'm discarding the very lucky ones whose parents qualified automatically for schools like the Haberdashers' Asks and others founded by what was considered in those days as trade. Public schools have always had and always will have a pride of place and a waiting list of pupils, even though they might be mainly from abroad or footballers' brats, notwithstanding the odd Labour Prime Minister's offspring, of course. No village school for them and then down the pit. Of course nowadays we also have the tiger mothers who spend a fortune on their children with Mandarin lessons and £75 an hour extra tuition. In my day we had extra tuition, but in schools. Now we have Michael Gove changing the exams and everyone up in arms about it. Well, from what I see, we indigenous Brits have very little to worry about. Because in the news, and not to be avoided, was the fact that all of the so-called pupils pictured taking their final exams, judging by their ages, not one was white. So why should teachers be upset by the changes? Well, of course Ofsted judge a school and their financial input into it by the pass rate of the students, and if most if not all the students are ethnically challenged, you have to make the exams as easy to pass as possible. It ain't rocket science. Personally, I think the reverse thinking of bringing back the A-levels is a good thing. In my day we didn't have coursework all through the terms, we just had swatting time before the end of term exams and of course the lead up to the last two exams before leaving school and entering college if wanted, culminating in the old A-levels. They got an opinion from an African girl, mainly because there was no one else to ask, and she could barely speak English and her patois was encapsulated. To have to remember 2 years of study is too hard, isn't it? And I had the most uncharitable thought of go home matey or words to that effect. So once again the establishment is restructuring our children's education systems and it will not suit the ethnically challenged or the non-English speaking pupils, and that is why it will not go ahead. The reason they killed off grammar schools was that they could choose who they took in, and some might not have welcomed the influx of a virtual tribe of Asians or Muslims who do not want anything more than the basic English education, or Africans who in some cases do not want to be educated at all. In my last small private school after my convent, which was lovely, we didn't get past the Industrial Revolution because every time a new pupil came in we had to go back to sodding 1066. I was so sick of Harold and William the Conqueror by the time I left. When I went into further education I got taught the rest. God only knows what would happen in state-funded schools where they have to accept hundreds of non-English speaking children to whom teaching English must be a priority, let alone actually teaching subjects in that language. This is where the teachers and the state are at odds, although united in their mantra of all inclusivity and the school of common purpose, which consists of putting all their efforts into educating the ethnics, white girls to some extent, and ignoring young white youths. The England they foresee for tomorrow doesn't need white men, it just needs white girls for some jobs, and the ethnics for the professional jobs, and the unskilled immigrant workers to keep the house prices up and the basic rate of pay down and going down further. So you can say that the state education system is again trying to accommodate our ever-growing immigrant population at the expense of our own youth. They've made entry exams into so-called universities made over from polytechnics and art colleges so easy that you have to be pretty thick not to pass. In fact, it has been reported that 95% of parents were stumped by sums set for 8-year-old pupils. Now that is indicative of the third generation of probably state-educated adults today who for the most part have been the recipients of the overhauled state system of comprehensive schooling. And it says a lot, doesn't it? In the good old days Oxbridge was just that, Oxford and Cambridge, with a very few other proper universities spread around the UK. Nowadays practically every town has a university full of progressives of all ethnicities and shades of pink, most of which would have been better off taking an apprenticeship or going to a good old-fashioned polytechnic or college of further education. But that of course was when we only had to consider our children's future, not the entire third world and their generations to come. So you know where I stand. Make the exams in the future less in number and raise the standards on them. So if youngsters do not pass into a well-funded and totally unnecessary uni, tough. Like shopping, I prefer to get an item from a shop that stocks that item, and not all items. Take away uni status from frankly undeserving colleges, who only exist because of the foreign students anyway, turn them back into technical colleges for a new manufacturing base in this country, and restart medical facilities for just medical students, farming colleges for farmers, and start looking after our own children's futures. Build up a knowledge base for our youngsters and sod the rest. If they do not have all the advantages they have now, it might discourage a good few from coming over here in the first place and being a drain on our society, country and culture. We are the only country in the world that lies on its back with its paws in the air whilst facing huge changes and challenges which affect all of us and our children in the future, and which need not be changed for Johnny Foreigner. Most of our immigrants come from countries that take our foreign aid, so let them build their schools over there, not redraw ours to accommodate them. Surely we cannot go on being so stupid for so long. And finally, a councillor for Carys in North Wales woke up to find someone had spray painted an 8-foot drawing of a penis on the side of his house. The Flintshire police had been called in to investigate the obscenity on Councillor Jim Falshaw's abode. He commented that he is disgusted and said it has never happened before. The image was painted at night time right underneath his bedroom window, and the neighbour's car had a large set of breasts spray painted on the windscreen in orange paint. Apparently it is said that his neighbours in the village saw nothing, but the local police are looking closely into these drawings. This presenter says, "I wonder what the underlying message is to this man." You've been listening to The World at 8. I'm Lynn Mozart, and I and the team at World at 8 and Radio Britain wish you all a very happy and safe weekend.